A tall, thin man in a British Army uniform walks under a white flag and a Union Jack along a road in Singapore on the afternoon of the 15th of February, 1942. Lieutenant General Arthur Percival, General Officer commanding Malaya, is on his way to the Ford Motor Factory at the edge of the city, where he will negotiate the largest surrender in British military history. Behind him, somewhere in the burning streets, are more than 80,000 soldiers. Ahead of him, at a boardroom table inside the factory, is a Japanese general named Tomoyuki Yamashita, who is almost entirely out of artillery ammunition and has known for several days that if the British chose to fight on for another 24 hours, his own position would likely collapse. Tell me in the comments whether you think what happened in Singapore in February of 1942 was inevitable, the product of decisions made across 2 decades in offices far from the Johor Strait, or whether different choices at specific moments might have averted it. Because what you are about to discover will permanently change how you answer that question. The truth behind that photograph has been building since 1923. The story that carries it touches a naval base no fleet ever used, a warning report that nobody acted on, a general exiled for winning, and the most consequential military bluff of the modern era. To understand what that image actually represents, you first have to set aside the week of fighting that produced it, and the 70 days of retreat that preceded the fighting, and go back further still, back to the 1920s, to a decision made when Britain still believed it could manage the defense of an empire covering 1/3 of the Earth's surface, and when the question of how to defend Singapore had an answer that seemed, for 15 years, entirely adequate. That answer was called the Singapore Strategy. Its logic rested on a single calculation. If Japan ever threatened British interests in Asia, the Royal Navy's main battle fleet would sail from home waters to the Singapore Naval Base within 70 days, and Singapore needed only to hold out until it arrived. The island was not the defense. The fleet was the defense. Singapore was the destination, the harbor where a relieving fleet would refuel, rearm, and advance to engage Japanese forces in the South China Sea. Everything about the island's physical design followed from this premise. The naval base at Sembawang, which when completed in 1938, contained what was then the largest dry dock in the world. The great coastal artillery batteries at Changi and Buena Vista, their 15-inch guns pointing seaward to destroy any warship attempting approach. The layered harbor defenses and searchlight arrays that made a direct naval assault a near impossibility for any force. The Sultan of Johor donated £500,000 toward the gun batteries alone. When the King George VI graving dock opened in February of 1938, it was a statement not merely of engineering, but of imperial intention. By 1937, according to the naval historian Stephen Roskell, the concept of the main fleet to Singapore had, through constant repetition, assumed something approaching the inviolability of Holy Writ. Its premises were genuinely coherent in 1923, when construction of the naval base began. Japan's nearest significant military base was in Formosa, more than 1,000 miles from Singapore. Aviation technology could not project air power over meaningful distances. Britain faced no serious rivals in European waters, requiring permanent deployment of its battle fleet. A strategy of holding out 70 days for naval relief was, in those specific conditions, militarily workable. What followed across the next 2 decades was a slow erosion of every condition on which the strategy depended, conducted silently, never acknowledged publicly, and never converted into a revision of the doctrine itself. The expected fleet arrival window was extended from 70 days to 90 in the early 1930s. By 1939, it had grown to 180 days. Each extension was a quiet, internal acknowledgement that the original timeline was no longer credible, never stated as such in any communication that the Australian and New Zealand governments, whose security rested on the commitment, were permitted to read. The language of impregnable fortress, Gibraltar of the East, and assured British supremacy in Asia continued unchanged, because changing it would have required acknowledging something the imperial machinery had no mechanism for processing. Then there were the guns. Among the most persistent misconceptions about February of 1942 is that Singapore's coastal batteries faced only seaward and could not be turned to engage a threat approaching from the north across the Johor Strait. This is partially false and wholly insufficient as an explanation. Most batteries had been modified by 1939 to improve their traverse, and during the battle, they fired over 2,000 shells inland. Direction wasn't the problem, ammunition was. The batteries had been stocked with armor-piercing shells designed to penetrate steel hulls at sea. When those shells landed on soft jungle earth, the fuses did not function. One gunner later recalled finding crates stamped with the year 1898. More damaging still was the absence of any defensive preparation on the island's northern shore, the coastline facing directly across the Johor Strait toward the Malay Peninsula, the direction from which any overland attack would necessarily arrive. No significant barbed wire, no pillboxes, no anti-tank obstacles, no gun positions calculated to cover the probable crossing points. 6,000 engineers were available, and none had been set to work there. The stated justification was that defensive fortifications in rearward areas were bad for morale. Doctrine had defined which threats were worth defending against. A land assault through the Malayan jungle did not qualify. No one who designed Singapore's defenses had seriously examined what would happen if it did. No one, except a staff officer named Percival, who had been stationed in Malaya between 1936 and 1938, and had, during that time, conducted an assessment of how a Japanese attack on the island might actually be mounted. His analysis described an approach through southern Thailand, south along the Malay Peninsula, and across the Johor Strait from the north. His recommendations for defensive fortifications in southern Johor were submitted to the War Office, which reviewed them and found them incompatible with the existing framework. The report was filed. Nobody had seriously asked what happened when the threat came from the north. The man who had asked and answered would return to Singapore in 1941 to discover that nothing had been done with the answer. Arthur Ernest Percival was born on the 26th of December, 1887, in Espendon, Hertfordshire, the son of a tenant farmer. He attended rugby school, graduated in 1906, and went not into the army, but into commerce, clerking for an iron ore merchant in London for the next 8 years, a thoroughly civilian life. On the 4th of August, 1914, the day Britain declared war on Germany, Percival was 26 years old. He joined the Officers' Training Corps that afternoon. The career that followed was, by any standard measurement, distinguished. Western Front service, the Battle of the Somme, a serious wound near Thiepval in September of 1916, while leading his men into an assault, and from that service, the Military Cross, 2 distinguished service orders, and the French Croix de Guerre. He proved himself a diligent, methodical staff officer, thorough in administration, reliable in planning. The interwar British Army rewarded exactly these qualities, and he advanced steadily through Staff College at Camberley, counterinsurgency duty in Russia and Ireland, postings to Nigeria and Malta, and the Imperial Defense College course in 1935. The gap between his record and his capacity as a crisis commander was described with unusual directness by those closest to the situation. Duff Cooper, dispatched by Churchill to Singapore as resident minister in the Far East, confided his judgment to the Prime Minister in terms that have not softened with the decades. Percival was not a natural leader and could not take a large view. It was all a field day at Aldershot to him. He knew the rules and followed them closely, always waiting for the umpire's whistle to cease fire. His superior Henry Pownall, who had known Percival since their service together in France, described him in his diary as an uninspiring leader and rather gloomy. He was personally brave. He was not the kind of commander who imposed his will on circumstances. That distinction had never cost him before, because circumstances had never demanded it. When appointed general officer commanding Malaya in April of 1941, he arrived knowing what he was walking into. The garrison was under-resourced, the doctrine governing the island's defense was strategically bankrupt, and the gap between what existed and what was required could not be closed in the time available. He had been documenting this since 1936. He began doing what he could with what he had. Tomoyuki Yamashita was born on the 8th of November, 1885, on the island of Shikoku, the son of a rural doctor. A career soldier from the outset of his adult life, he moved through the Imperial Japanese Army with a range of experience unusual even for his generation, including regimental command, staff postings, foreign assignments in Germany and Austria, and combat command in China. His professional ability was not in dispute. His politics were a recurring liability. The February 26th incident of 1936, an attempted coup by young Imperial Army officers whose factional alignments overlapped with his own, became the pivot of his career. Yamashita appealed to the government for leniency toward the rebels. Emperor Hirohito did not forgive the appeal. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, a former rival who had watched Yamashita with professional wariness for years, ensured the misstep had consequences. Through the years in which Japan was building toward its largest military expansion, Yamashita was kept in Korea and Manchuria, command postings that carried no prospect of distinction, away from the theaters where reputations were being made. He was assigned the 25th Army in November of 1941, 6 weeks before the invasion of Malaya was to begin. The intellectual groundwork had been laid not by him, but by Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, whose 10-man unit on Formosa had spent 6 months from January of that year interviewing regional experts, logistics specialists, and veterans of jungle combat, and had produced from those conversations a military doctrine built from first principles for Malayan terrain. Yamashita was offered 4 divisions and took 3, correctly calculating that speed was more decisive than mass for a campaign whose success depended on outpacing the British ability to respond. He wrote in his diary that he was frightened. Taking 30,000 men against a garrison he knew to exceed 80,000, along supply lines that would be stretched across 700 miles of peninsula, with everything depending on a performance of irresistible strength that had to be sustained without interruption. He understood that the moment the British discovered how thin the resources behind that performance actually were, the campaign would end in disaster. There was nothing to fall back on if the deception failed. He was sent back to Manchuria on the 17th of July, 1942, 2 months after his greatest victory, without being allowed to visit Tokyo or seek an audience with the emperor. The general who had just broken the British Empire's position in Asia was too popular for Tojo to permit near power. He spent the subsequent years in administrative obscurity, studying Zen Buddhism and waiting until the collapse of Japan's inner defense perimeter in 1944 forced a desperate recall. The 2 men who would meet at the Ford factory boardroom were mirror images of each other's institutional difficulty. Percival had been trained to follow established doctrine in a situation that demanded improvisation. Yamashita was capable of improvisation and had been given 6 weeks to plan the campaign that expressed it. Between them, they had studied Singapore's vulnerabilities more carefully than anyone else on either side of the strait. Percival had described those vulnerabilities in a 1936 report that was filed without consequence. Yamashita had used them to construct a plan that worked in 70 days. What would determine the outcome of that plan had begun forming 2 days before Yamashita's troops left their assembly areas in southern Thailand. It formed in the South China Sea on the morning of the 10th of December, 1941, east of the Malayan coastal town of Kuantan. Churchill had dispatched 2 warships to Singapore in November as an act of deterrence. HMS Prince of Wales was among the newest and most powerful battleships in the Royal Navy, having engaged the Bismarck earlier that year. HMS Repulse was an older battlecruiser, but a formidable presence. Together, they had been visible from Singapore's waterfront when they arrived, a material demonstration that Britain was serious about the region's defense. No rational Japanese planner, the reasoning ran, would risk a campaign requiring confrontation with capital ships of this class operating from a fortified base. Japan declared war 6 days after they docked. On the morning of the 10th of December, both vessels were sunk by Japanese aircraft east of Kuantan. They had sailed without fighter escort because the Royal Air Force in the region lacked the aircraft to provide it. 840 men died. With them went the foundational premise of every calculation Singapore's defense had been built around. There was no fleet. There would be no fleet. The naval base at Sembawang, the greatest British military installation east of Gibraltar, constructed at enormous expense over 2 decades, housed no navy capable of using it. The fleet was not coming because the fleet was defending Britain itself. News reached the garrison within hours. Every soldier on the peninsula understood, before any communique had processed what to say, that they were fighting in a situation the Singapore strategy had promised would never exist. The picture in the air was equally definitive. The Royal Air Force and Royal Australian Air Force were equipped primarily with Brewster Buffaloes, aircraft that Allied pilots discovered almost immediately could not compete with Japanese Zero fighters in any meaningful engagement. 51 Hurricanes arrived in Singapore in early January of 1942, more capable, but arriving into a situation already fundamentally compromised by weeks of Japanese attack on the northern airfields. By the 8th of February, the Royal Air Force had ceased to exist as a fighting force in the theater. Japanese air supremacy was complete. Troops defending the island would do so under daily bombing, without coverage from above, with no means to interdict what was moving toward them. There was one dimension to the Japanese advantage that the garrison knew nothing about at all. In November of 1940, the German commerce raider Atlantis had intercepted the British merchant vessel Automedon in the Indian Ocean. Among the cargo were sealed diplomatic bags intended for the Commander-in-Chief Far East. Inside them was a War Office assessment of British military strength across the region, prepared with the candor reserved for documents never expected to leave British hands. It evaluated the inadequacy of the garrison, the weakness of the air forces, and the vulnerability of the naval position in terms British public communications had never employed. The Germans passed it to Japan. Japanese planners had entered 1941, holding a British-authored account of British weakness in the Far East, prepared by the British themselves. Japan entered the campaign with a document produced by British planners accurately describing the weakness of British defenses. Britain did not know Japan had it. The landings began at 2:15 in the morning of the 8th of December, 1941, more than an hour before the attack on Pearl Harbor, a precedence Japanese accounts consistently noted and Western histories consistently subordinated. Advanced troops came ashore at Kota Baru on Malaya's east coast and at Singora and Patani in southern Thailand simultaneously, under darkness, against defenders still absorbing intelligence that an invasion had begun. Within hours, Japanese aircraft were bombing Singapore City. The Pacific War had started in Malaya. The Japanese had not arrived with bicycles. To accelerate the landings, the bicycles had been left in Japan. Within hours of coming ashore, soldiers were confiscating them from Malayan civilians along the coastal roads. The image became emblematic of a campaign whose logic ran deeper than any single element. Bicycles allowed infantry to move through jungle paths at speeds that outpaced any defensive withdrawal. But the more decisive advantage was doctrinal. Tsuji's unit had spent 6 months on Formosa, building a military system designed from first principles for this terrain, this climate, and this opponent. The defending force had been designed for a different kind of war. At every major defensive position, the British attempted to establish down the length of the peninsula. The same sequence played out. Japanese infantry fixed the main line frontally, while flanking columns moved through terrain. British assessments had classified as impenetrable, appeared behind the defenders before the forward engagement had resolved, and cut lines of communication and retreat before a coherent response could be organized. Units prepared to fight from their front found Japanese soldiers materializing among their rear areas. This was a repetitive experience that accumulated across 7 weeks into something beyond physical exhaustion. It eroded the capacity to distinguish between a tactical withdrawal and a collapse that was not going to reverse. The Battle of Gibraltar, fought on the 11th and 12th of December, 1941, established the pattern. The 11th Indian Division held a position that had been prepared with care and whose commanders believed it was defensible. The Japanese fixed them frontally and went around. The division's coherence did not survive the encounter. Unit records from the entire campaign described the same conditions throughout the weeks that followed. Defensive positions hurriedly prepared and abandoned before they were properly occupied, finding Japanese forces behind them as well as in front, going without food or sleep for days in equatorial heat and monsoon rain. A gradual erosion of the capacity for decision-making that sustained exhaustion produces when there is no end in sight. Kuala Lumpur fell on the 11th of January, 1942, without a fight. The Japanese entered the Malayan capital unopposed. Singapore was less than 200 miles to the south. There was one significant reversal. On the 14th of January, soldiers of the 25th Australian Battalion ambushed a Japanese column at the Gamenche Bridge near Gamas and inflicted up to 600 casualties, the largest Japanese tactical setback of the entire advance. The bridge was demolished during the fighting. The Japanese repaired it within 6 hours, and the advance continued south. The last Allied troops crossed the Johor Causeway on the 31st of January, 1942. Engineers detonated charges in the causeway structure, blowing a 70-foot gap. Japanese repair took hours. What arrived on Singapore Island in the days that followed was not an army preparing to defend a fortress. It was what remained of a force that had retreated without pause for 55 days across 700 miles, many without weapons or equipment, abandoned in the withdrawal, all carrying something the official communiques had no language to describe, produced by the accumulated experience of an enemy that arrived every time where it was not supposed to be able to be. General Archibald Wavell had inspected the island's northern defenses on the 7th of January. He found no prepared positions, no significant obstacles, no anti-tank emplacements, no plan for contesting a crossing of the strait. His reaction, as preserved in the accounts that survived, was simple shock. By the 1st of February, 1942, Yamashita stood on the southern shore of the Malay Peninsula and looked across the Johor Strait at the island, whose fall he had been assigned to accomplish. His actual situation was the opposite of what his campaign projected. He had approximately 30,000 men available for the assault on the island itself, against a garrison he knew to exceed 80,000. His supply lines had been stretched across the full length of the peninsula his army had traversed, and they were not keeping pace with what the campaign had consumed. Each soldier had roughly 100 rounds per day remaining. He had 18 functional tanks. More than 4,500 men had been lost since the landings at Kota Baru. He wrote in his diary that he was frightened. The performance of overwhelming strength could not afford a single moment of transparency. Everything depended on Percival not discovering that the force crossing the strait was outnumbered by the garrison it was assaulting, that the supply chain was at the edge of what it could sustain, and that a determined British counterattack at almost any point in the preceding weeks would have exposed the Japanese position as critically overextended. There was no contingency behind it. The campaign had to end before the fiction could fail. The preparation for the assault included one act of deception that worked with complete precision. On the evening of the 7th of February, Japanese forces raided Pulau Ubin, a small island off Singapore's northeastern coast near Changi. The raid was repelled. Its purpose was not to succeed. Percival, already inclined by the geography of the situation to expect the main assault from the northeast, near the causeway, and the most logical crossing point, interpreted the Pulau Ubin action as exactly the prelude he had anticipated. He moved major ammunition stores east to support what he believed would be the critical defensive engagement. His freshest and strongest formation, the 18th British Infantry Division, newly arrived from England, and at full strength, though with no experience of jungle fighting, was deployed in the northeastern sector to receive an attack that was not coming. Percival had placed his best troops exactly where the attack was not going to come. The northwestern coast of Singapore was marshy, cut by mangrove swamps and small inlets, and had been assessed by British planners as unsuitable for amphibious landings. No coastal gun batteries covered the northwestern approaches. The terrain Yamashita had selected as his crossing point was the terrain British defensive planning had dismissed. He had chosen it for precisely the reason the British had discounted it. It was difficult. His troops had been prepared for difficult terrain. The British assessment of what was passable had been consistently wrong since the campaign began. Beginning at 11 in the evening of the 8th of February, Yamashita's artillery opened a bombardment of the Australian positions in the northwest. Over the following 15 hours, 88,000 shells were fired along the strait, cutting telephone lines and isolating forward units from their commanders. British artillery that could have struck Japanese assembly areas on the Malayan shore received no orders to do so. Malaya Command expected the bombardment to shift toward the northeast. It did not shift. Shortly before 8:30 on the evening of the 8th of February, the first wave of Japanese troops from the 5th Division and the 18th Division began crossing the Johor Strait in assault boats and barges toward the northwestern coast. The Australian 22nd Brigade was in position and fought hard, inflicting significant casualties on the landing force, but they were fighting without communications to their commanders, without artillery support, against soldiers prepared to absorb losses to establish the crossing. By morning, the beachhead was secured. Subsequent Japanese landings on the 9th of February met no opposition at the shore defense positions. Wavell flew into Singapore from his Java headquarters on the 9th of February and confronted Percival and Australian Divisional Commander Gordon Bennett with the directness of a man who had traveled far to deliver it. "Our whole fighting reputation is at stake," his order read. "The honor of the British Empire." He demanded an immediate counterattack. It was attempted and achieved nothing against forces already consolidating miles inside the island. By that morning, Yamashita had established his headquarters north of Tenga Airfield, 5 miles inside the island, and less than 10 miles from the outskirts of Singapore City. The battle's decisive moment came on the 10th and 11th of February, when Japanese forces drove into the Bukit Timah area at the island's center. At 600 feet, Bukit Timah Hill was the highest ground on Singapore and commanded the surrounding territory, which contained what remained of the garrison's reserve supply. The largest Allied fuel and ammunition depots on the island were there. The Pierce and McRitchie reservoirs, supplying fresh water to more than 1 million people, were there as well. When the Japanese took Bukit Timah, They took the garrison's reserves in a single sustained action. Food stocks were reduced to approximately 48 hours. The water supply for 1 million civilians was now under Japanese physical control. Bukit Timah was not a defensive position. It was the reserve supply for an entire garrison, and the Japanese took it in a single day. Churchill's cable arrived on the 10th of February. There must at this stage be no thought of saving the troops or sparing the population, it read. Commanders and senior officers should die with their troops. The honor of the British Empire and of the British Army is at stake. This message reached a command with less than 48 hours of food, losing control of the city's water supply, and troops whose morale had been eroded by 60 days of continuous withdrawal. The distance between what was demanded and what the situation permitted was not bridgeable by instruction alone. Yamashita sent Percival a letter on the 11th of February urging surrender to avoid needless casualties. He was simultaneously spending artillery shells he could not replace, firing his diminishing reserves at Allied positions to maintain the appearance of inexhaustible strength. Percival refused the demand. He was being offered surrender by a man whose divisional commanders were already reporting critical shortages, who knew that the fiction of overwhelming force could not be sustained much longer. The fiercest resistance the Japanese encountered in the entire campaign came on the 13th and 14th of February at Pasir Panjang Ridge, the ground soldiers called Bukit Chandu, Opium Hill, for the cultivation that had once occupied its slope. Here, the Japanese 18th Division drove against the 1st Battalion of the Malay Regiment in sustained force, supported by tanks and artillery. The regiment had been established by the British in 1933 as a colonial experiment. The founding question, stated without diplomatic cushioning, was whether the Malays had the temperament to form an effective modern fighting force. At Pasir Panjang, the Japanese 18th Division found the answer. C Company of the 1st Battalion, 42 men, commanded by Lieutenant Adnan bin Saidi, held its position at Pieps Road for 2 days against repeated infantry assaults, artillery bombardment, and armored support. Adnan was 27 years old, slight in build, carrying a Lewis machine gun. When Japanese soldiers attempted to approach his position, disguised as Punjabi troops, Adnan identified the deception and opened fire, cutting down many of the approaching column. As ammunition diminished and the pressure intensified, the fighting became close quarters and then hand-to-hand. Severely wounded, he refused evacuation. The Malay proverb he had adopted as his personal code translates as, "Let the bones turn white, but never the eyes." Death before dishonor. His commanding officer, Captain Harry Ricks, a Cambridge-educated lawyer who had become a soldier, was cut down by machine gun fire on the slopes of Opium Hill on the 14th of February, 1942. 1 day before the surrender, he did not live to witness. The Japanese 18th Division's commanding general, Lieutenant General Mutaguchi Renya, said afterward that more than 4,000 of his men were killed or wounded in the fighting for Singapore. The majority fell in the sectors where the Malay Regiment stood its ground. While the fighting at Pasir Panjang was still in progress, Japanese forces moving deeper into the Alexandra area reached the British military hospital. The hospital was marked by Red Cross flags clearly visible at the distances involved. A British officer walked toward the approaching soldiers carrying a white flag. He was bayoneted. The troops entered the building. In the operating theater, they killed a patient on the table and the surgical staff attending to him. They moved through the wards. Around 200 staff and patients were taken outside, bound, and locked into 3 small rooms overnight, without water in equatorial heat. On the morning of the 15th of February, they were brought out, tied together in threes, and executed. The total killed at Alexandra Military Hospital over 2 days was approximately 280 people. The explanation Japanese commanders offered after the war that British soldiers had fired on their troops from within the hospital was not supported by any evidence that subsequent examination produced. By the 13th of February, the defending perimeter had contracted to roughly 28 miles in circumference around Singapore City. 1 million civilians were compressed into the area still held by Commonwealth forces. Japanese bombardment intensified as the perimeter shrank. Water engineers advised Percival that large volumes were being lost through damaged pipes that could not be repaired under fire, and that complete failure of the city's supply was a matter of hours, not days, away. The morning of the 15th of February was when Arthur Percival went underground, not in retreat, but to make the decision that would attach his name permanently to an event whose foundations had been laid 20 years before he set foot in Asia. The underground command bunker at Fort Canning, the Battle Box, held his final command conference at 9 in the morning. 12 senior officers attended, including the commanders of the Indian and Australian formations and the garrison's fortress commander. Together, they assessed the same arithmetic every man in the room had been living with for days, compressed to its final statement. No fuel for vehicles, artillery ammunition nearly exhausted, food for less than 48 hours since the Bukit Timah depots were lost. The city's water supply measured in hours for more than 1 million people sheltering in the perimeter. Major Cyril Wilde, one of the 12 officers present, recorded that the decision to ask for terms was taken without a dissentient voice. Percival was not overruled. He was not pressured into a conclusion his subordinates opposed. He was confirmed unanimously in a judgment that every officer who understood the facts had independently reached. Across the perimeter at that same hour, Yamashita's divisional commanders were reporting to their corps commanders that they had almost no artillery ammunition remaining. He had ordered his guns to fire to the last round that morning, spending resources he could not replace in a final demonstration of strength that had nothing genuine behind it. A determined British counterattack at that exact moment would have found the Japanese position dangerously exposed. At the moment Percival signed the surrender documents, Yamashita's divisional commanders were reporting that they had almost no artillery ammunition remaining. He said afterward that he felt if they had had to fight in the city, they would have been beaten. The Japanese required that Percival come himself to the Ford Motor Factory, in person, on foot, under the white flag and the Union Jack, along the road that Japanese press corps cameras were already positioned to record. The walk was photographed comprehensively, filmed, and distributed across Asia. Its purpose extended well beyond recording a military event. These images were designed to show the British Empire, the empire whose language of impregnable fortress and Gibraltar of the East had defined how Asia understood European authority for generations, being visibly and photographically defeated by an Asian military force in front of a watching world. A Japanese officer who observed Percival's arrival noted that he looked pale, thin, and tired. He had chosen to come himself. He believed his being there might obtain better treatment for his troops and for the civilian population. It was a personally brave decision in a situation where no available choice was good. There was a different model accessible to him at that same hour, and it was being exercised by someone of the same rank. Major General Gordon Bennett, commanding officer of the Australian 8th Division, whose troops had borne the initial Japanese assault on the northwestern shore on the night of the 8th of February, and who had been present throughout 7 days of island fighting, handed command to Brigadier Cecil Callahan and departed Singapore by boat on the evening of the 15th of February with a small party of officers. He reached Australia and described his departure as a military necessity. Tactical lessons from the campaign needed to be transmitted to forces preparing for future operations. The Australian military establishment did not accept this account. Bennett was never given another command. The men of the 8th Division, who had fought on the northwest coast and at Jamus, and at Pasir Panjang, and through every stage of the withdrawal, remained on Singapore Island and laid down their arms. The commander of the Australian division walked away from Singapore on the night of the surrender. The men he commanded did not. Percival arrived at the Ford Motor Factory and sat across the table from Yamashita. Japanese press accounts of the meeting bear limited relationship to the exchange that actually occurred. Yamashita demanded immediate, unconditional surrender. He struck the table with his fist, a gesture reported across Asia as the Tiger of Malaya crushing the British commander beneath the force of Japanese military will. What it was, in the reality Yamashita understood with complete clarity, was a man spending the last of his authority to prevent anyone in the room from asking a single question. How much ammunition did the Japanese actually have? Percival asked for conditions. He wanted the right to keep 1,000 men under arms in Singapore City to maintain civil order. He knew what had happened at Alexandra Hospital the day before. Yamashita conceded this minor point. He would not concede time. When Percival requested a delay until the following morning to organize the ceasefire, Yamashita replied directly, "Until tomorrow morning, we will continue the attack. Is that agreeable? Or will you surrender unconditionally now?" Percival agreed. At 10 minutes past 6 in the evening of the 15th of February, 1942, the surrender document was signed at the Ford Motor Factory in Bukit Timah. All Commonwealth troops were ordered to lay down their arms and cease resistance at 8:30 that evening. 70 days after the landings at Kota Bharu, Singapore had fallen. British and Commonwealth losses across the entire campaign came to around 9,000, killed and wounded. Japanese losses were approximately 3,000 killed and 7,000 wounded. More than 80,000 people on Singapore Island, among them roughly 16,000 British soldiers, 14,000 Australians, and 32,000 Indians, together with Malay and other Commonwealth forces, became prisoners of war, joining the 50,000 already taken during the Malayan campaign. The Tiger of Malaya later described the strategy that had produced all of this, a bluff that worked. In London, Churchill's physician, Lord Moran, recorded what followed. Churchill was stupefied. The surrender stunned him. He felt it was a disgrace. It left a scar on his mind. Months later, Moran found him in his bathroom wrapped in a towel, stopped in the middle of drying himself, staring at the floor. "I cannot get over Singapore," he said. The 80,000 men who laid down their arms were marched east across Singapore Island toward the barracks complex at Changi and the surrounding area. Percival could be seen among them in those first days, sitting outside the married quarters he shared with 7 other senior officers, head in his hands by the account of those who observed him, spending hours walking the compound, turning over the campaign and its alternatives in the silence that captivity provided for the purpose. 3 days after the surrender, Yamashita authorized the Kempeitai, Japan's military police, to identify and remove hostile elements within the Chinese population. Around 200,000 Chinese men between the ages of 15 and 50 were assembled at collection points across Singapore and the Malayan Peninsula for interrogation. The process was arbitrary in its application and systematic in its consequences. Men were condemned for tattoos, for financial connections to the China Relief Fund, for books found in their homes, or in many cases, for no identifiable reason the surviving records can reconstruct. They were taken to coastal sites at Changi Beach, Punggol, Tanah Merah, and Blakang Mati, and killed by shooting or drowning. The figure the Japanese government acknowledged after the war was 5,000 deaths. The Singapore government's estimate exceeded 70,000. Historians working from available evidence place the number between 25,000 and 50,000 across Singapore and the peninsula combined. This dimension of what happened after the military surrender, the systematic killing of the civilian population, in the weeks immediately following, receives a fraction of the attention devoted to the campaign that preceded it. It is not a footnote to the story. It is central to it. Among the military prisoners, one response to captivity measured more directly than anything else in the record what the fall of Singapore had communicated. Roughly 40,000 of the Indian soldiers taken prisoner joined the Indian National Army, established under Japanese auspices, and subsequently fought against British forces in Burma. A third of the Indian prisoners taken at the largest surrender in British military history turned their weapons against the empire that had sent them to Malaya. This was not an aberration requiring elaborate explanation. It was a measurement of what those men had concluded from the specific experience of what had just happened about the empire whose flag they had been fighting under. Beginning in May of 1942, around 60,000 Allied prisoners of war were transported from Singapore and other camps across Southeast Asia to construct a railway the Imperial Japanese Army needed to connect Bangkok with Rangoon, 415 kilometers of track through jungle, mountain, and equatorial swamp, built by human labor and completed in 12 months. British prisoners formed the largest Allied national group, with roughly 29,000 sent to the Thailand section. F-Force, 7,000 Australian and British prisoners sent to the most remote section near the Thai-Burma border in 1943, suffered a death rate of 44%. 3,096 of the 7,000 died. Cholera, dysentery, malaria, beriberi, and a form of systematic destruction that medicine had not fully named, compounded by the denial of rations to men too ill to work and punishment for infractions real and invented. Brigadier Arthur Varley, commanding the Australian component on the Burma section, wrote in his diary on the 24th of May, 1943, that the Japanese would carry out their schedule and did not mind if the line was dotted with crosses. Around 12,800 Allied prisoners died on the railway in total. The Asian civilian laborers, the Romusha, mostly Burmese and Tamil Malayan workers, numbered some 200,000. Roughly 90,000 died, a mortality rate approaching 50%. The British government provided reparations after the war to the 60,000 Allied prisoners who had worked the line, not to the civilian laborers who died alongside them. Their deaths were not entered in the official accounting. The British government conducted no formal court of inquiry into the fall of Singapore, no court-martial, no parliamentary commission with powers over the witnesses whose testimony would have been most revealing. Churchill had called it the worst disaster and largest capitulation in British history, language that in any other institutional context would have triggered formal accountability proceedings. The formal proceedings did not happen. The failure was too widely distributed to be attributed to any individual without simultaneously indicting 20 years of imperial planning, 2 decades of budgetary decisions, and the strategic doctrine that had been the cornerstone of British defense policy in Asia since 1923. Attributing it to one man required not examining any of that. The image of Percival walking under a white flag became the event. The report he filed in 1936, which had accurately described what Yamashita would do in 1941, did not. Subsequent historical analysis has largely exonerated Percival as an individual while finding the systemic failure comprehensive. He inherited a garrison inadequate for the task assigned to it, a strategic doctrine that had become a fiction long before he arrived to execute it. No armor, insufficient air cover, and troops whose condition after the Malayan retreat made the defense of the island effectively unwinnable before the first Japanese soldier crossed the strait. The Singapore strategy, built on premises that had been eroding throughout the 1930s, was never publicly scrutinized the way Percival's photograph was scrutinized. 20 years of underfunding passed without formal examination. The repeated rejection of requests for defensive fortifications, including his own 1936 report, generated no institutional inquiry. Australian Prime Minister John Curtin had already written in his New Year message for 1942 that Australia looked to America, free of any pangs as to its traditional links or kinship with the United Kingdom. Singapore's fall turned this from a political declaration into an existential, strategic reorientation. Britain had demonstrated that it could not protect the alliance it had asked Australia to rely upon for 20 years. The Australian partnership with the United States, which has remained at the center of Australian security thinking through Korea, Vietnam, the Cold War, and the conflicts of the early 21st century, was born in the specific moment when Singapore's defense failed. Adolf Hitler, informed of the event by his foreign minister, reportedly forbade any congratulatory communication to Japan and described the fall as a setback for the white race. The observation is repugnant in its framing and exact in its analysis. What every colonized population in Asia absorbed from the photographs of Percival's walk was that European military supremacy in Asia was not a permanent condition. It was a performance, one that required the belief of those subject to it in order to function. On the 15th of February, 1942, a Japanese general almost out of ammunition demonstrated that the performance was exactly that. Historian Alan Warren's assessment has not been significantly challenged. The fall shattered the British Empire's illusion of permanence and strength, making European empires in Asia unsustainable beyond the short term. The reconquest of Malaya and Burma after Japan's surrender did not restore what had been lost. Prestige, once the mechanism of authority has been publicly seen to fail, does not reconstitute itself at the point of military reversal. Yamashita was tried by an American military tribunal in Manila from October of 1945, charged with command responsibility for atrocities committed by forces under his authority in the Philippines. He was convicted and hanged on the 23rd of February, 1946, the first major Second World War commander to be executed. Modern Singapore marks the 15th of February as Total Defense Day, a national day of reflection on vulnerability and the cost of depending on others for security. Since 2015, sirens sound across the island at 6:20 in the evening, corresponding to the actual time of the surrender. The boardroom at the Ford Motor Factory is now a museum, its permanent exhibition documenting the occupation and the experiences of those who lived through it. The fall of Singapore was not a surprise. It was a filed report that finally happened. The thin man under the white flag walked toward the Ford Motor Factory on the afternoon of the 15th of February, 1942, carrying in his hands the consequence of decisions made in offices he had never been permitted to enter and in documents he had submitted and watched be disregarded. He had been right about all of it. He had described in a report filed in 1936 what Yamashita would do in 1941. He had been told the strategic framework had no room for it. He had arrived in Singapore in 1941, knowing the framework was wrong, and spent 9 months finding no mechanism by which that knowledge altered anything. At the table in the Ford factory boardroom, the man waiting for him was almost entirely out of ammunition, had been sustaining a fiction of irresistible strength since the first assault boat crossed the strait, and would later describe the strategy that produced the largest surrender in British military history as a bluff that worked. Behind Percival, in the burning city, were 80,000 soldiers. In the weeks that followed, 40,000 of the Indian soldiers among them would take their own reading of what the image meant and act on it. In the months that followed, thousands would begin the march north toward a railway that would kill them at 44% in the worst sections. The Ramusha who died alongside them were not counted. None of this appears in the photograph. What appears in the photograph is a man walking. The Gibraltar of the East was not a fortress. It was a belief. And on the 15th of February, 1942, the belief ran out before the ammunition did.